It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in a modest cafe tucked away in a quiet corner of Manhattan, where the hum of conversation blended seamlessly with the sound of espresso machines steaming milk. The aroma of freshly baked pastries filled the air, and the small wooden tables, each with its own unique scratch marks, stood as quiet witnesses to the ebb and flow of daily life. The cafe, despite its humble appearance, had always attracted a strange blend of people: tourists, locals, and occasionally someone you'd never expect to see in such an unassuming place. But that Tuesday was different. As Barron Trump, the youngest son of the former president, sat at a corner table near the window, lost in the pages of a thick novel, few in the cafe recognized him. The sunlight streamed in, casting a warm glow on his face, and for a brief moment, he looked just like any other young man, tucked away in the world of books and quiet contemplation. The tall figure, with his usual understated demeanor, wasn't the sort of person who drew attention. The buzz around his name, the whirlwind of politics that had once enveloped him, felt like a distant echo now. But this was New York, and New York had a way of making things interesting. There, in the midst of the chatter and the clink of coffee cups, a man walked in. He was ordinary in the way New Yorkers often were, unremarkable in appearance, yet somehow holding an air of urgency about him. His gaze swept over the room, seemingly in search of something or someone. When his eyes locked onto Barron, a flicker of recognition passed through his face. He wasn't just looking at a young man in a cafe. He was seeing an opportunity, or maybe a confrontation. The man approached the table, his footsteps deliberate. Barron looked up, momentarily startled by the presence of the stranger. They locked eyes for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the weight of the moment to hang in the air. Then the stranger spoke. "You're Barron Trump, right?" It was the kind of question that most people might ask out of curiosity, but the man's tone wasn't casual. It wasn't a mere acknowledgement. There was something deeper behind it, something unsettling. And so, the stage was set. What happened next would challenge everything Barron thought he knew about his life in the public eye. And in that small, unassuming cafe, a simple question would set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. Barron's hand paused mid-air, the faint tremble of surprise betraying the calm exterior he worked so hard to maintain. For a moment, he considered ignoring the man, just going back to the novel that had provided a much-needed escape from the world of headlines and relentless eyes. But something about the stranger's gaze, intense and unflinching, made it impossible to simply brush him off. "Yes, that's me," Barron said, his voice steady but guarded. He closed the book with a soft snap, resting his hands on the table, instinctively, trying to mask the unease that rippled beneath his surface. The stranger didn't smile or offer a hand, as one might expect in a casual encounter. Instead, he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, as though he had waited years for this very moment. There was no friendly air in his posture, only an unmistakable sense of purpose, like a man who had set out to prove something, to draw out a truth that had remained hidden for far too long. "You don't know me," the man began, his voice rough, almost deliberate, as if weighing each word. "But I know who you are. I've followed your family's rise and fall. And let me tell you, it's not over, not by a long shot." Barron blinked, his stomach turning as he tried to make sense of the stranger's words. What did this man want? And why now, of all times? The last few years had been quiet for Barron. He had distanced himself from the media circus, focused on his studies, and tried to lead as normal a life as possible. But now, with just a few sentences, everything felt unsettled, like a glass of water rippling with an unseen force beneath the surface. "Why are you telling me this?" Barron asked, his voice betraying a subtle edge. His mind raced, trying to assess the threat level. Was this man dangerous? Or just a crackpot? The stranger smirked, almost as if Barron had asked a silly question. "Oh, I'm telling you because you need to understand something, Barron. This isn't just about your family anymore. This is about you. You've been living in the shadows for too long, but the world is watching, whether you like it or not. And sooner or later, you're going to have to decide which side you're on." Barron's pulse quickened. The words were vague, cryptic, but they were laced with an undeniable tension. The stranger wasn't here to talk politics or history. He was here to push Barron into something deeper, something more personal. And Barron wasn't sure if he was ready for whatever that meant. Before Barron could respond, the man stood up, his chair scraping against the floor in a sharp protest. He took a step back, eyes still locked on Barron, who now felt a familiar sense of dread tighten around his chest. "You'll know what I mean soon enough," the stranger said, his voice soft but with an edge of finality. "You'll see." And with that, he turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving Barron sitting at the table, utterly still, trying to process what had just happened. The cafe was still bustling, the noise of conversation washing over him, but it felt distant, muffled, like the world had suddenly gone out of focus. His mind was reeling. Was this some kind of warning? An attack? Barron had always known that his family's history would follow him. But this was something different. A personal challenge, wrapped in veiled threats and shadows. As he looked down at his phone, he saw a message from his mother, Melania Trump. "Are you okay?" Barron's finger hovered over the screen, uncertain of how to respond. He was far too proud to admit he felt rattled. But even more so, he didn't want to worry her. He had never been one to share his worries. His relationship with his parents had always been complicated, even more so after the years of constant media scrutiny. But this was different. His heart hammered in his chest as he tapped out a quick reply. "I'm fine, don't worry." But inside, he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep pretending that everything was normal. Barron tried to shake off the lingering unease as the days passed, but the encounter in the cafe kept creeping into his thoughts. The stranger's cryptic words gnawed at him, spinning around his mind like an unsolvable puzzle. The worst part was that it wasn't just paranoia. He could feel the weight of something shifting, something more ominous than just idle chatter. His life, once quiet, was now a little more unpredictable. The next morning, Barron was at his apartment, sipping on coffee and staring out the window at the city that never seemed to stop moving. He had planned to focus on his coursework and continue with his usual routine. But every time he picked up a book or looked at his laptop, his mind wandered back to the cafe. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was an email from a journalist. "Barron, I know you're busy, but I'd like to talk about something important. Can we meet?" His stomach dropped. The name attached to the email wasn't familiar, but the tone was direct, almost too casual for someone who hadn't even introduced themselves. Barron stared at the screen for a long moment, debating whether to ignore it. Ignoring it seemed like the best choice. After all, he had no reason to engage with someone who was clearly trying to pry into his life. But then, the memory of the stranger's words came rushing back. "You've been living in the shadows for too long. Sooner or later, you're going to have to decide which side you're on." Barron had always been able to keep his head down, to avoid being sucked into the chaos. But what if that wasn't enough anymore? What if, for reasons he couldn't yet understand, he was about to be dragged into something far beyond his control? With a heavy sigh, Barron picked up his phone and responded, agreeing to meet. The meeting took place at a small, dimly lit cafe in the Lower East Side. The journalist, a woman in her late 30s named Clara, was sharp-eyed and no-nonsense. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Let's cut to the chase," she said after Barron sat down across from her. "I've been following the movements of your family for years, and I've come across something I think you should know about. It's not good, Barron. Someone's been digging into your past. And it's not just any journalist. Someone who's connected, someone with a lot of power. I'm not sure what they want, but I think they're targeting you next." Barron felt the blood drain from his face as the words sank in. He hadn't expected this direct, in-your-face approach. His first instinct was to dismiss her, to walk away, and pretend none of this was happening. But something about Clara's demeanor stopped him. She wasn't trying to get a story, she was trying to warn him. "How do you know this?" Barron asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara looked around the cafe before leaning in closer. "I have sources," she said, her tone quiet but urgent. "Trust me, this is bigger than you think. Someone's got an agenda, and it's not just about you. It's about everything your family represents. They're pulling strings, manipulating narratives, and you're the next piece on the board. Barron felt a sudden surge of fear mixed with frustration. He didn't want to be part of this. He hadn't asked for it, and he didn't want any more attention. He had spent years trying to carve out a life away from the headlines, trying to be just a guy in a cafe, reading a book, and pretending he wasn't part of the circus. "What do you want from me?" Barron asked, his voice tight with a mix of anger and confusion. "I want you to help me," Clara said, her eyes steady. "I'm not asking you to get involved in anything illegal. But whatever's coming, Barron, it's going to hit you harder than you expect. You have to be ready. I can't do this alone." Barron recoiled, his gut twisting in a way he hadn't expected. It felt like a trap, like he was walking right into the spotlight again, just when he thought he'd escaped. He wanted to say no. He wanted to walk out, disappear, and leave all this behind. But the weight of his last encounter, the stranger's ominous warning, held him in place. What choice did he have? He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing, and for the first time in days, he felt the full force of his doubt creeping in. Was he ready for this? Did he even have the strength to fight? The world he had spent so long trying to avoid was closing in, and it was no longer a question of whether he could escape. It was whether he could survive it. The path ahead seemed murky, and Barron couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The moment Barron left the cafe, a sense of dread settled over him, heavier than anything he had felt in months. Clara's words echoed in his mind, turning over and over, each repetition digging deeper into his thoughts. He had hoped to avoid being part of the circus that defined his family, but now it was clear. That choice had never truly been his. There was no escaping it. As Barron walked along the busy streets of Manhattan, his phone buzzed again. He pulled it from his pocket, already bracing himself for another cryptic message or call from someone who wanted something from him. Instead, it was an alert from a news app. Breaking: Trump family scandal exposed. Barron Trump at the center of it all? His heart skipped a beat. The headline was almost absurd, almost laughable. But the article was anything but. The content was a mixture of half-truths, speculation, and intimate details about Barron's life that he hadn't shared with anyone. His history, his relationships, even his private thoughts were now on display for the world to see. Whoever was behind, this wasn't just digging into his past. They were constructing a narrative, weaving together fragments of his life into something far more dangerous than anything Barron had ever imagined. The article didn't just talk about his family. It painted Barron as a central figure, a puppet, at the mercy of powerful forces. It painted him as a young man with a secret agenda, someone who had been playing a long game of politics and manipulation from the shadows. The insinuations were so bold, so calculated, that Barron felt like the world had suddenly turned against him, like his very identity had been hijacked. He slammed the phone down onto a nearby bench, his fingers trembling. How did they know this? He had never shared any of this information with anyone. The details were too specific, too personal. For a moment, Barron stood there, feeling exposed, vulnerable, like a character in a story he never agreed to be part of. But then it hit him. The stranger in the cafe, the journalist's warning. It all came crashing together in a flash of realization. Clara hadn't just been warning him about some vague threat. She had been speaking about this very moment, about the forces that were already in motion to drag him into something much bigger than himself. Someone wanted him to be a player in a game he had no part in. His phone buzzed again, and Barron's breath caught in his throat. This time it was a text message from an unknown number. "You're next, Barron. You'll have to choose a side." His hands clenched into fists, his anger rising like an uncontrollable wave. The message wasn't from the journalist, but it was clear now that whoever had set all of this into motion knew exactly how to manipulate him, how to push him into a corner. He wasn't just a bystander anymore. He was a pawn, caught in a game, with no way out. Barron felt a surge of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: defiance. For too long, he had tried to stay out of the spotlight, to keep his distance from the manipulations and betrayals that seemed to surround his family. But now, there was no choice. He could no longer play the role of the quiet observer. He had been dragged into the storm, and the storm wasn't going to pass quietly. His hands shook, But with each passing second, the anger inside him grew stronger. Barron knew that this moment would define everything: who he was, what he stood for, and how far he was willing to go to protect himself and those he loved. He could no longer remain passive, a mere observer in his own life. For the first time, Barron felt the weight of his own agency, the power to act, to decide, to fight back. But who could he trust? That question burned in his mind as he walked faster, moving away from the city's chaos and towards something unknown, something darker than he had ever anticipated. He was no longer just Barron Trump. He was a man at war. The night was thick, with tension, the city's pulse a distant hum as Barron stood before the looming glass doors of a high-rise office building. The invitation had come through, seemingly from nowhere. But Barron had learned to trust his instincts by now. He'd been pulled into something bigger than himself, and tonight he would face whatever waited at the top of these steps. He had spent the last few days digging into the shadows, following cryptic leads, and meeting with people who seemed to know more than they let on. It wasn't just the press or the mysterious journalist anymore. It was the people in the background, the puppet masters, the ones who had been controlling the narrative for years. Barron had pieced together enough to know that this wasn't just about politics or public opinion anymore. This was about power. The elevator ride up felt like an eternity. With every passing floor, Barron's thoughts raced, his heart pounding against his ribs. He was about to confront the force that had been orchestrating his every move, the people who had threatened his family's legacy and manipulated his identity. He wasn't just fighting for his own truth anymore. He was fighting for the chance to rewrite the story being told about him. When the elevator doors opened, he stepped out into a sleek, minimalist hallway. The dim light reflected off the polished floors, casting shadows that made the space feel colder, more impersonal. At the end of the hall, a door opened, and there, standing in the doorway, was the last person Barron had expected to see. Clara. "You came," she said, her expression unreadable. Barron didn't answer at first. Instead, he looked around the room. It was sterile, too perfect. But the people inside weren't. They were familiar faces, power players who had once smiled at him on the campaign trail, people who had used his family's name for their own gain. Why? Barron's voice was a whisper, barely audible, but the weight of it pressed heavily into the room. "Why pull me into this?" Clara's face hardened. "Because they'll destroy you if you don't play along," she said, her words sharp. "But I can help you. I can show you how to take control of the narrative, to turn this around." Barron felt a surge of something dark rising within him. Resentment, fear, and something else. Something more powerful. It wasn't just about playing along. He was done being the pawn. The stakes had been made clear, and now Barron knew what he had to do. With a steady breath, he stepped forward, looking every one of them in the eye. "I'm not playing your game," he said, his voice stronger than it had ever been. "It's time for me to write my own story." And for the first time, Barron felt the truth of those words. The game had changed. He wasn't just a player anymore. He was the one holding the pen. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of Barron's declaration hanging in the air. Clara didn't move, and neither did the others. They were all watching him, perhaps expecting fear or hesitation, or the usual obedience that came with someone young and untested. But Barron stood tall, his resolve firmer than it had ever been. He wasn't the boy they thought he was. He wasn't the product of his family's past. He was someone else now, someone who had decided to take back control. "Do you really think you can walk away from this?" one of the men at the table asked, his voice cold, dismissive. Barron didn't flinch. "I'm not walking away. I'm standing up," he replied. His eyes locked with his, steady and unwavering. Clara, standing at the doorway, seemed to be weighing her options. She had warned him that this wouldn't be easy, but there was something different in the way Barron held himself now. His journey, the doubts, the threats, the sleepless nights, had led him to this point of clarity. This was his story, and he was ready to take the risks that came with it. Without another word, Clara moved aside, allowing Barron to walk past her. He didn't need her permission anymore. As he passed through the door and into the night, the weight of the decision began to settle. There were consequences to defying the forces that had controlled his family for so long. He knew that. But the cost of not taking action, of letting his story be written by someone else, was far worse. The next few weeks were a blur. Barron met with lawyers, reporters, and allies, people who had once been silenced by fear. He took back the narrative piece by piece, turning the tide of public opinion in ways that shocked everyone. It wasn't just about fighting back against the media or the people who had targeted him. It was about reclaiming his life and the truth. He wasn't going to be defined by the headlines, by the shadows that loomed over his name. He was Barron, Trump, and this was his moment to step out of the shadow. The calls came, the emails, the meetings. Barron learned to navigate the world with a new sense of purpose. He wasn't the same person who had sat in that cafe months ago, lost in a book, and trying to stay out of the spotlight. He had found his voice, and with it came the understanding that no one, not even the powerful forces that had tried to manipulate him, could take that away. He was no longer just a symbol of a past he didn't control. He was an individual, a man, ready to shape his own future. As Barron stood on the balcony of his apartment one evening, watching the city lights flicker below, he couldn't help but smile. The journey had been harder than he ever imagined. But the view from here, standing on his own 2 feet, was worth every step. The world was still waiting, but Barron wasn't afraid of it anymore. He had learned the most important lesson of all. The story is never over until you decide how it ends, and Barron was just getting started.